The sterile, air-conditioned hum of the office cafeteria provided a stark, modern backdrop to the ancient argument unfolding at a corner table. Alex, a software engineer whose world was built on binary logic and verifiable code, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched his coworker, Sarah, bow her head for a silent moment over her salad. To him, the gesture was a relic, a quaint superstition in a world he had rationally deconstructed. He saw the universe as a magnificent but accidental machine, and faith was merely a bug in the human operating system, a persistent, illogical glitch. He decided to poke at it, his tone laced with the condescending patience of a developer explaining a simple concept to a non-technical user. He began with the cosmos, painting a picture of vast, indifferent emptiness, where the laws of physics were the only scripture. What need was there for a divine author when the Big Bang provided a perfectly serviceable, if spectacular? Prologue? He watched her, waiting for a flicker of doubt in her calm eyes, but found only a quiet steadiness that irked him. Undeterred, he pivoted to the problem of suffering. His voice took on a sharper edge as he listed the world's catalog of miseries, wars, diseases, natural disasters. He laid out each example like a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence. A truly benevolent, all-powerful deity, he argued with cold, clean logic, was an impossible paradox in the face of such rampant, pointless agony. The very concept was not just unlikely, but intellectually dishonest, a comforting fairy tale for those who couldn't bear the stark truth of a godless existence. Then he landed his most pointed blow, aiming directly at the heart of her hope, the afterlife. He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with intellectual superiority. The idea of an eternal soul, he declared, was the ultimate cope. He described the human brain with clinical detachment, a magnificent biological computer. When the power supply was cut, when the heart stopped and neural activity ceased, the software simply ceased to exist. There was no cloud backup for consciousness. To believe otherwise was to embrace a delusion, a fear-driven fantasy invented to soften the terrifying finality of the grave. He mocked the very imagery of heaven and hell as primitive, human-centric constructs, utterly absurd when held against the cold, hard light of empirical science. Throughout his monologue, Sarah had simply listened, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't interrupt or become flustered. Her silence, he assumed, was a testament to the unassailable nature of his arguments. He saw it as a victory for reason. He finished, taking a satisfied sip of his coffee, the warm liquid a tangible, real thing in a world he was so sure he understood. He felt the familiar glow of his own intellect, a fortress built on skepticism that looked down upon the fragile houses of faith. He had dissected her beliefs with the precision of his code and found them full of errors. As they gathered their trays to return to work, Alex felt not a shred of remorse, only the solid, unshakable conviction that he was on the right side of history, a beacon of enlightenment in a world still clinging to its comforting shadows. The morning sun cut sharp, geometric patterns across the polished floor of Alex's high-rise apartment, a world governed by clean lines and predictable outcomes. He moved through his routine with the efficient grace of a well-written algorithm, each action a subroutine in the code of his day. Shower, dress, coffee, all executed without the need for divine intervention. Standing before the mirror, knotting his tie with practiced ease, he allowed himself a moment of smug reflection. He was a man of reason, his mind a fortress built not on faith, but on data, logic, and the unassailable laws of physics. The fervent believers he so often debated online were like children, clinging to comforting stories in the dark. While he walked confidently in the stark, illuminating light of science, his commute was a river of steel and glass, a testament to human ingenuity. From the climate-controlled interior of his car, he observed the city waking up. And there, on his usual corner, was the street preacher, a familiar spectacle of what Alex considered profound foolishness. The man stood on a small crate, a weathered Bible held aloft in one hand, his voice a raw, straining instrument against the city's din. He spoke of sin and salvation, of a judgment to come and a grace that was freely offered. Alex didn't even bother to roll down his window. He simply watched, a detached anthropologist observing a primitive ritual. The preacher's passionate gesticulation, the desperate earnestness in his eyes, it all seemed so theatrical, so utterly pointless. Alex's fingers tapped a rhythm of impatience on the steering wheel. He dissected the sermon in his mind, picking apart the logical fallacies, the unverifiable claims, the emotional manipulation. It was a performance designed for the weak-minded, for those who needed an external crutch for their existential anxieties. The light turned green, and Alex drove on, leaving the preacher and his message in the auditory dust, another relic successfully ignored, another confirmation of his own intellectual superiority. The sleek glass tower that housed his software firm was his true cathedral. Here, in the hum of servers and the glow of monitors, was a realm where cause and effect were absolute, where problems had solutions, and where belief was irrelevant next to performance. But today, the sanctuary felt more like a pressure cooker. A high-stakes presentation loomed in the afternoon, a make-or-break moment for a project he had championed. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, a tangible, secular dread. He buried himself in his work, the code on his screen a refuge of pure logic. Yet with every potential bug he hunted, every line of script he refined, the anxiety coiled tighter in his gut. His rational mind knew the stress was a simple biochemical response, adrenaline and cortisol flooding his system, a survival mechanism misfiring in a boardroom instead of a savanna. There was no grand design behind this feeling, no spiritual test. It was just physiology, a flawed and often inconvenient aspect of the human machine. This reinforcement of his secular worldview was a small comfort, but it did nothing to ease the tightening knot between his shoulder blades or the faint, persistent tremor in his hands as he rehearsed his talking points, alone in the stark silence of his office, a man trying to command a universe that was, at its core, indifferent to his success or failure. The world had shrunk to the cold blue glow of his monitor, the lines of code, a frantic, scrolling prayer to a god he didn't believe in. The silence of the empty office was a physical presence, broken only by the frantic clatter of his keyboard and the ragged, shallow rhythm of his own breathing. The high-stakes presentation was hours behind him, a supposed success that had left him feeling hollow and drained, but a new, more insidious deadline now loomed. A critical system bug, a cascade failure that threatened to undo all his work, had emerged just as he was about to leave. Panic, a purely chemical and irrational response, he assured himself, had been quickly suppressed by a surge of stubborn pride. He would fix it. He had to. His body, however, was sending its own error messages, a series of warnings his rational mind had spent a lifetime learning to ignore. A dull, persistent ache had taken root between his shoulder blades hours ago, which he attributed to poor posture. A tightness in his jaw he chalked up to stress. He consumed coffee like a fuel, the bitter liquid doing little to cut through the fog of exhaustion that threatened to pull him under. He was a machine, and machines did not succumb to phantom pains or emotional fatigue. They ran until their task was complete or their power failed. The first true signal was a sudden, sharp twinge deep in his chest, a hot needle of sensation that made him gasp and still his fingers above the keys. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a ghost of unease. He shook his head, dismissing it. Indigestion from the terrible takeout he'd inhaled at his desk. Stress. It was always stress. He took a deep, deliberate breath, or tried to. The air felt thick, resistant, as if he were trying to inhale water. He pushed back from the desk, intending to stand and stretch, to prove to his own traitorous body that he was still in command. That was when the vice clamped down. It was not a twinge or an ache, but a crushing, monumental weight that seized his entire chest, squeezing the air from his lungs in a choked, silent gasp. White-hot pain, absolute and terrifying, radiated outwards, shooting down his left arm and clawing its way up into his jaw. The world tilted on its axis. The sleek, modern lines of his office blurred and swam into a nauseating smear of color and shadow. His hand, moving of its own volition, clutched at the epicenter of the agony, fingers scrabbling uselessly against the fabric of his shirt, as if he could physically pry the invisible fist from his heart. His legs gave way, the connection between brain and muscle severed by the overwhelming shock. He collapsed, his shoulder hitting the industrial carpet with a dull, sickening thud. The ceiling tiles spun above him, a dizzying checkerboard of white and shadow. He tried to draw a breath, a desperate, ragged gasp, but his lungs were stone, his ribs a cage of fire. This was not stress. This was not indigestion. This was a system failure of the most fundamental kind, a catastrophic crash from which there might be no reboot. As the edges of his vision began to tunnel into an encroaching darkness, his mind, that fortress of logic, made one last, defiant stand. This was it. The end of the algorithm, the final termination of consciousness. He felt a bitter, ironic laugh bubble in his ruined chest, a sound that never made it past his lips. So this is dying, he thought, the words forming with a strange, detached clarity. No angels, no pearly gates, no judgmental old man on a cloud. His final, coherent thought was not of love or regret or fear of the unknown, but a final, contemptuous sneer at the absurdity of it all. Just nothing. An empty black. The thought shattered as the last of the light was extinguished. The pain, the office, the world, all of it was swallowed whole by an absolute, silent, and impenetrable darkness. The fall was not a fall through space, but a fall through substance, a thick, suffocating medium that was neither air nor water, but a distillation of pure despair. The silent, sterile blackness that had first claimed him was now ripped away, replaced by a roaring, oppressive heat that seared his senses. He was tumbling, spiraling downward into a cavernous expanse where the very atmosphere seemed to weep and bleed agony. The first thing that registered, beyond the scalding temperature, was the sound. It was a symphony of torment, a cacophony of screams that were not merely loud, but layered with an eternity of anguish. They were not cries of physical pain alone, but the raw, shredded sounds of souls being unmade, of hope being systematically extinguished. He landed not on a surface, but in a landscape, his feet sinking into a gritty, ash-like ground that radiated a feverish warmth through the soles of his shoes. The air was thick and heavy, difficult to breathe, each inhalation a lungful of scorching, sulfur-laden fumes that stung his nostrils and coated his throat. He stood, his body trembling not from cold, but from a pervasive, soul-deep dread that was seeping into him, challenging the very foundations of his being. Before him stretched a vista of unimaginable bleakness. A dull, blood-orange glow emanated from a cracked and fissured earth, illuminating a terrain of jagged black rock formations that clawed at a sky the color of a fresh bruise. There were no stars, no moon, only this perpetual hellish twilight. Shadowy figures moved through the gloom, their forms indistinct and wavering like heat haze. They were not walking with purpose, but writhing, contorting in slow, perpetual motions of suffering. Some were hunched over, their backs bowed under invisible weights. Others clawed at their own faces or at the unyielding rock, their silent, open-mouthed screams adding to the horrific chorus. He could feel their despair as a physical pressure, a psychic wind that carried the essence of their eternal regret. This was not a place of fire and brimstone in the cartoonish sense he had once mocked. It was a realm where punishment was the environment itself, a dimension crafted from the consequences of a life lived without light. A wave of comprehension, cold and absolute despite the infernal heat, washed over him. This was the destination he had so confidently denied, the realm whose very concept he had torn apart with sarcasm and logic. There was no rationalizing this away. The sensory overload was too complete, too visceral. The heat that blistered his skin, the stench that choked him, the sounds that drilled into his skull, this was more real in its horrifying way than the office he had just left. His atheism, that proud, unshakable fortress, crumbled in an instant, its walls turned to sand before the overwhelming, terrifying reality of divine judgment. He was not a spectator. He was not having a hallucination. He was in hell, and the agonized, shadowy forms around him were his new, eternal neighbors. The initial shock of his surroundings hardened into a permanent, grinding reality. The oppressive heat was no longer an external force, but had become a part of him, searing his lungs with every ragged breath and baking his skin until it felt like cracked leather. He began to move, not out of any sense of purpose or destination, but because the searing ground seemed to demand it, the radiating heat forcing him into a slow, shuffling march deeper into the desolation. Each step was an agony, the gritty ash clinging to his feet, feeling less like soil and more like the powdered remains of forgotten souls. The air itself was a thick, viscous medium, resisting his passage, each inhalation a conscious effort that brought no relief, only the taste of cinders and despair. The isolation was a living entity, wrapping around him tighter than any chains. Though he was surrounded by a multitude of suffering forms, he was utterly, profoundly alone. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged his presence. The other souls were trapped in their own private cycles of torment, their eyes vacant pools reflecting the hellish orange glow, seeing nothing but the endless replay of their own failures. He tried to speak, to call out, but his voice was a dry, rasping whisper swallowed whole by the cavernous wails and the low, constant rumble of the earth. His intellect, once his greatest pride, was useless here. There was no logic to appeal to, no system to debug, no rational argument that could counter the visceral, overwhelming truth of his damnation. As he wandered, the landscape began to shift, becoming a twisted gallery of his own sins. The screams that echoed around him started to form into recognizable words, the very taunts and jeers he had once typed with such smug satisfaction. Fairy tale, delusion, primitive superstition. The words boomeranged back at him, not as sound but as sensations, searing brands on his conscience. He passed a figure endlessly scrubbing at its eyes with hands that were raw and bleeding, and he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that this was a man he had mocked for his blind faith. Another soul was forced to consume a bitter, black substance that made it retch violently, a grotesque echo of the poison of religion Alex had so often warned others about. He was not just witnessing punishment, he was witnessing the direct karmic consequences of his own mockery, each agonized soul a mirror reflecting a fragment of his own spiritual cruelty. A profound and absolute hopelessness descended upon him, heavier than the heat, more suffocating than the foul air. This was his eternity. There was no appeal, no parole, no end to the cycle. He had chosen this path not with a single act, but with 1,000 casual sneers, a lifetime of arrogant dismissal. He had built his own prison from the bricks of his intellectual pride, and now he was condemned to wander its halls forever, a ghost haunted by the echo of his own voice. He sank to his knees, the scorching ground biting into his flesh, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of his regret. He had no tears to shed. The heat had burned them away before they could form. He was empty, a hollow vessel filled only with the absolute certainty of his own deserved fate. It was in that moment of complete surrender, when the last ember of his defiance had been extinguished, that he saw it, far in the distance, a pinprick of light. It was not the angry orange of the hellfire, but a soft, pure white. It was so faint he thought he might be imagining it, a final trick of a broken mind. Yet it held steady, a single, unwavering star in the bruised and starless sky of this damnation. It did not belong here. It was an impossibility, an anomaly in the perfect, terrible logic of this place. And as he watched, a feeling he had not thought possible began to stir in the frozen core of his being, not hope, not yet, but the faint, terrifying whisper of its possibility. The light did not approach. It simply was, a fixed point of impossible purity in the swirling chaos of damnation. It grew no larger, yet its influence began to permeate the oppressive atmosphere around him. The cacophony of screams, which had been a constant, drilling pressure against his mind, seemed to soften at the edges, as if muffled by a gentle hand. The searing heat that had baked his very soul lost a fraction of its intensity, not replaced by coolness, but by a sudden, profound absence of malice. The light pulsed with a slow, rhythmic cadence, and with each soft beat, a wave of something entirely foreign washed over the desolate landscape, a sensation of profound, unassailable peace. Then the light was upon him, not as a beam from a distance, but as an enveloping presence that surrounded him completely. It did not blind him. Instead, it seemed to cleanse his vision, allowing him to see with a clarity he had never possessed in life. The jagged rocks, the ash-choked ground, the writhing figures, they were all still there, but viewed now through a lens of infinite sorrow rather than wrath. Within this gentle luminescence, he felt a consciousness, a being of such immense and focused compassion that it made his own existence feel like a single, insignificant grain of sand on a vast shore. And then a voice spoke. It was not a sound that traveled through the corrupted air to strike his eardrums, but a resonance that bloomed directly within the core of his being, a whisper that was quieter than thought yet more powerful than any thunder. The voice spoke of mercy, not the cheap, conditional pardon he might have imagined, but a divine, bottomless wellspring of grace that was offered even here, at the very heart of consequence. It spoke of a love so vast it could encompass even the most ardent mocker, a redemption so complete it could rewrite the story of a soul that had authored its own damnation. The words were not a lecture or a condemnation of his past, but a simple, heartbreaking statement of fact. He was seen, he was known in all his arrogant failings, and he was still, impossibly, loved. The voice hinted that the gates of this place were not locked from the outside, but from within, by the stubborn, clenched fists of pride and rejection. It offered a key, not of works or intellectual assent, but of humble, desperate acceptance. For a timeless moment, Alex existed within this bubble of solace. The weight of his guilt, which had felt like a mountain crushing his spirit, became a burden that was being gently lifted from his shoulders. The agonizing memories of his mockery were not erased, but their sharp, condemning edges were smoothed over by a profound understanding of their true cost, and an even more profound offer of forgiveness. He was not being told he was innocent. He was being told he was redeemable. This was the truth he had spent a lifetime running from, not with his feet, but with his mind. It was the answer to the existential dread he had masked with sarcasm, the fulfillment of a longing he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. In that moment, bathed in a compassion that defied all logic, the last vestiges of his intellectual resistance melted away, replaced by a raw, aching need for the grace being so freely offered. Then with the sudden, violent finality of a snapped cord, it ended. The gentle light vanished, not fading, but extinguished in an instant. The compassionate presence was gone, leaving a void more terrible than the original despair. The full, brutal force of the heat and the screams and the stench rushed back into the space it had vacated, a sensory avalanche that crushed him anew. He felt a terrible, physical pulling, as if a hook had been set deep in his soul and was now yanking him backward, away from the glimpse of mercy, away from the whispered promise. He was dragged back through the thick, suffocating medium, the fleeting solace torn from his grasp, leaving behind only the searing, indelible memory of the light and the haunting, beautiful echo of the voice that had spoken his name. The first sensation was a dull, rhythmic beeping, a sterile metronome counting out a time he did not recognize. It pierced the absolute silence that had followed the violent tearing away from the light, a sound so mundane and technological it felt alien, a relic from a forgotten life. Then came the smell, antiseptic, clean and sharp, a brutal contrast to the memory of sulfur and ash that was still seared into his olfactory memory. Alex tried to open his eyes, but his lids were heavy, gummed shut as if weighted with the grime of that other place. A low groan escaped his lips, a raw, unfamiliar sound. A blur of movement resolved into a figure in pale blue, a face swimming into focus above him. A nurse, her expression professionally calm, her touch cool and efficient as she checked a monitor beside his bed. His body felt like a foreign object, a clumsy, pain-riddled shell. A deep, bruised ache throbbed in his chest with every beat of his heart, a heartbeat that now felt like a precarious, stolen gift. Tubes snaked from his arm, and a plastic clip pinched his finger. He was in a hospital bed, the rails up, a prisoner in a world of white sheets and fluorescent lights. The Disorientation was total, a vertigo of the soul. One moment, the searing heat of damnation and the impossible, heart-shattering whisper of mercy. The next, this clinical, quiet room. The transition was so jarring it felt like a new kind of torture. A doctor entered, his demeanor a blend of practiced reassurance and clinical detachment. He explained the event in clean medical terms. A massive myocardial infarction. A widowmaker. Paramedics had been called. They had worked on him frantically in his apartment. For several seconds, he explained, Alex had been clinically dead. No pulse, no respiration. They had managed to restart his heart, to pull him back from the brink. The words clinically dead echoed in the sterile room, each syllable a hammer blow. They were just words on the doctor's chart, a dry medical fact, but to Alex, they were the key that unlocked the horrifying, vivid truth of his experience. Those seconds had not been an empty void. They had been an eternity in a landscape of despair, followed by a glimpse of a love so profound it had rewired his very being. As the doctor continued, outlining the next steps for his cardiac care, Alex stopped listening. A cold, primal terror began to seep through the haze of medication and exhaustion. It was not a fear of the damaged muscle in his chest, but a soul-deep, trembling horror at the memory that was now rising, unbidden and in perfect, agonizing clarity. The oppressive heat, the chorus of screams, the shadowy, tormented faces, they were not fading like a dream. They were solidifying, becoming more real than the IV in his arm, more immediate than the starched pillow beneath his head. He had not hallucinated. He had not experienced a brain-starved fantasy. He had been there. He had felt the absolute reality of hell, and he had been offered, and then violently pulled away from, a salvation he knew with every fiber of his resurrected being was equally real. He was back in the world, but he was a haunted man, a traveler returned from a country of nightmares, forever branded by the fire and the light. Sleep became a foreign country, a place Alex could no longer visit. The moment he closed his eyes, the sterile white of the hospital room would dissolve, replaced by the oppressive, blood-orange glow of that other place. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor would warp, its steady pulse twisting into the ragged, layered screams of the damned. He would lie perfectly still, his body rigid against the crisp sheets, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's cool air. It was a cruel, nightly pilgrimage back to the abyss. The memory was not a passive recollection. It was a visceral re-experiencing. The phantom scent of sulfur would flood his sinuses, so potent he would sometimes gag, his hand flying to his mouth. The sensation of scorching heat would bloom across his skin, a flush of remembered agony that had no source in the physical world, leaving him trembling and cold in its wake. His days were no better. The anxiety was a constant, humming presence in his chest, a tight coil of dread that lived alongside the healing scar tissue of his heart. A sudden noise, a cart rattling down the hallway, a raised voice from another room, would make him jump, his pulse skyrocketing as his mind instantly translated it into the echoes of that distant, eternal torment. He found himself staring at the other patients, the visitors, the hospital staff, seeing not their faces but the shadowy, contorted figures from his vision. He watched a man struggling to walk down the corridor with a physical therapist, his movements slow and pained, and for a horrifying second, Alex saw not a patient, but a soul bowed under an invisible, crushing weight. The world had become a palimpsest, with the hellish reality bleeding through the thin veneer of the ordinary. His atheism, once the bedrock of his identity, now felt like the ruins of a collapsed building, and he was sifting through the rubble, searching for a new foundation. He could no longer dismiss the experience as a hallucination born of oxygen deprivation. The doctor's rational explanations felt hollow, like trying to describe a symphony by analyzing the chemical composition of the air in the concert hall. The memory was too detailed, too coherent in its horror and its grace. It had the weight of truth, a truth that had fundamentally rewired his understanding of existence. The guilt was the most corrosive element. Every sarcastic blog post, every mocking meme, every condescending word he had hurled at Sarah and the street preacher and countless online believers, they all came back to him now, not as intellectual victories but as spiritual crimes. He had not just been wrong, he had been actively, arrogantly destructive, scoffing at the very mercy that had, impossibly, reached for him even in the pit. He was no longer a rational skeptic. He was a convicted man desperately seeking a pardon from a judge he had spent his life denying. The weight of the memory was a physical thing, a lodestone of dread and awe tied to his soul, pulling him deeper into the sterile hospital bed until he felt he might sink through the mattress and into the earth. It had been 3 days since his return to life, and the haunting clarity of his journey into the abyss and his fleeting brush with divine light had not faded. Instead, it had crystallized, becoming more real than the bland hospital food, more immediate than the gentle hum of the machinery keeping him alive. He was a man drowning in a secret ocean, surrounded by people who walked on dry land, oblivious to the depths that had opened beneath his feet. The need to speak of it, to give voice to the unspeakable, became a pressure in his chest that rivaled the pain of his healing heart. It was Nurse Anya who provided the crack in his dam of silence. She was different from the others, older, with eyes that held a quiet, weathered patience and hands that were not just efficient but genuinely gentle. She moved through her duties with a calm grace that seemed to soften the sharp, clinical edges of the room. When she checked his vitals or adjusted his IV, she did so with a focused presence that made him feel seen not just as a patient, but as a person. One afternoon, as she was helping him sit up to take his medication, a tremor ran through his hand, spilling a few drops of water onto the sheet. It was not a physical spasm, but a sudden, visceral flashback to the searing heat of that other place. He flinched, his breath catching in his throat. Anya paused, her gaze steady on his face. She did not dismiss it as a post-operative tremor or offer a platitude. She simply waited, her silence an open invitation. And in that quiet space, the dam broke. The words tumbled out of him in a choked, ragged torrent, stripped of the intellectual armor he had worn his entire life. He did not speak of logical fallacies or biochemical hallucinations. He spoke of the fall, the crushing despair, the smell of sulfur that felt more real than the antiseptic air he now breathed. He described the landscape of torment, the shadowy figures trapped in their cycles of agony, and the gut-wrenching recognition of his own mocking words echoing in their eternal suffering. His voice was a raw whisper, trembling with the terror of the memory. Then, haltingly, he spoke of the light. The impossible, gentle light that had pierced the absolute darkness, not to condemn, but to offer a mercy so profound it had shattered the very core of his being. He tried to describe the voice, the resonance of unconditional love that had spoken his name, the offer of a redemption he knew he could never earn. He confessed his absolute, unshakable certainty that it had been real, more real than the bed he lay in. He finished, his body spent, his eyes burning with unshed tears, bracing for her skepticism, for a gentle suggestion that he discuss this with a psychiatrist. Nurse Anya did not flinch. She did not offer a diagnosis. She listened with her whole being, her expression one of deep, non-judgmental attention. When he fell silent, she placed a calm hand over his trembling one on the blanket. Her touch was cool and grounding. She spoke softly, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the remembered screams still echoing in his mind. She told him that she had been a nurse for 30 years, and in that time she had learned that the human experience was far vaster and more mysterious than any medical textbook could contain. She had heard stories, she said, from others who had brushed against death and returned changed. Then she offered him a simple, life-altering suggestion. She told him that the hospital had a chaplain, a man named Father Mark, who was a good listener. He was not there to proselytize, she explained, but to offer comfort and a space for people to explore the big questions that often arose in times of crisis. She said it might help to talk to someone who was accustomed to discussing matters of the spirit, someone who wouldn't be frightened by the language of souls and damnation and grace. She presented it not as a command or a conversion tactic, but as a practical, compassionate next step for a man whose world had been irrevocably shattered. In that moment, Her simple suggestion was a seed, small and fragile, but planted deep in the fertile, broken soil of his spirit. It was the first, gentle nudge onto a path he had spent a lifetime mocking, the beginning of a journey he now knew he had to take. The polished glass and chrome of the software firm's lobby felt like a stage from a forgotten play, a set from a life Alex no longer recognized as his own. He stood just inside the automatic doors, his hand clenched around the strap of his laptop bag, his heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against his healing sternum. The air smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and ambition, a stark, scent-memory contrast to the phantom sulfur that still haunted his dreams. He had come back not for work but for a single, terrifying purpose. He had to find Sarah. The memory of their last conversation in the cafeteria was no longer a trophy of intellectual victory, but a shard of glass lodged in his conscience, its edges sharpened by the screams of the abyss. He had mocked the very hope that had, impossibly, reached for him in the pit, and the weight of that hypocrisy was a burden he could no longer carry. He saw her through the glass wall of a conference room, leading a morning stand-up meeting. She stood with the same quiet steadiness he remembered, her gestures calm and deliberate. Watching her, a fresh wave of the hellish heat seemed to wash over him, accompanied by the visceral memory of a soul he had seen endlessly scrubbing at its eyes, a direct, karmic reflection of his own mockery of her blind faith. The sight was a punch to his gut. He retreated to the empty break room, the silence there broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic pounding in his own ears. He poured a glass of water with a trembling hand, the cool liquid doing nothing to quench the spiritual thirst that now defined his existence. He waited, rehearsing words that felt hopelessly inadequate, a language of apology being learned by a man who had only ever spoken in accusations. When she finally entered the break room, her expression was one of mild, professional surprise. "Alex, I heard you were out on medical leave. Are you okay?" Her voice was kind, laced with a genuine concern that made his guilt flare brighter. He could not meet her eyes. He stared at the linoleum floor, his own reflection a pale, haunted smudge. The air grew thick, resistant, just as it had in his office before the fall. He forced the words out, his voice a low, ragged thing, stripped of all its former arrogance. He did not offer excuses or justifications. He spoke plainly, directly, of the lunchroom confrontation. He confessed to his intellectual pride, his condescension, his deliberate cruelty in tearing down what she held sacred. He called it what it was now, through the lens of his new, horrifying understanding. Not a debate, but a spiritual assault. He apologized not for a difference of opinion, but for the profound disrespect he had shown her, and for the mockery he had leveled at a truth he now knew was real. Then he told her everything. The words came in a flood, a confessional torrent he could no longer contain. He described the crushing pain, the fall into the suffocating darkness, the landscape of eternal despair where the very air was made of regret. He spoke of the screams, the heat, the faces of the tormented, and the gut-wrenching realization that his own words were part of the fabric of that place. His voice broke as he described the light, the impossible, gentle, all-encompassing light that had offered a mercy so profound it had shattered him. He finished, his body trembling, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers, bracing for the confusion, the disbelief, the dismissal he felt he deserved. Sarah did not speak for a long moment. She simply listened, her eyes holding his, absorbing the raw, unvarnished horror and awe in his story. There was no trace of "I told you so" in her expression, no vindication. Instead, he saw a deep, profound sorrow for his suffering and a flicker of something that looked like shared recognition. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, imbued with a strength that felt ancient. "Alex," she said, "I forgive you." The words were not a casual platitude. They were a deliberate, powerful act of grace, washing over him with a tangible warmth that momentarily silenced the echoes of hell in his mind. She then told him that his experience, while terrifying, was a gift, a brutal, merciful unveiling of a reality most people never see until it is too late. She offered not just her forgiveness, but her emotional support, her presence a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of his new existence. In her compassion, he saw a dim reflection of the divine mercy he had been shown, and it deepened his reflection on faith from a theoretical concept into the only possible response to a universe that contained both the abyss and the light that could pierce it. The thirst was a physical ache, a deep, unquenchable craving that no amount of water could soothe. It was a hunger of the spirit, born in the fiery pits of damnation and nurtured by the fleeting, divine light that had offered him a way out. Back in the sterile quiet of his apartment, surrounded by the sleek, modern artifacts of his old life, the high-performance computer, the books on atheism and quantum mechanics, the framed prints of cosmic nebulae, Alex felt like an archaeologist excavating his own tomb. These objects, once the proud trophies of his rational mind, now seemed like childish toys, utterly meaningless in the face of the eternal realities he had witnessed. He had to know more. He had to understand the framework of the universe he had so arrogantly dismissed, to find the words that could describe the indescribable grace that had touched him. He started with the Bible, the very book he had once cited as a source of primitive superstition and contradictions. He downloaded a digital copy, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard, a ghost of his old sneer trying to reassert itself. But the memory of the heat and the light was stronger. He began not at Genesis, but with a desperate, raw search. He typed hell into the search bar. The screen populated with verses, and he began to read, his heart hammering against his ribs. The words were no longer ancient poetry or myth. They were a stark, clinical diagnosis. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. The verse from Revelation landed like a physical blow, bringing with it the phantom scent of sulfur and the echo of endless screams. He read about the outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth, and each phrase was a perfect, horrifying label for the existential despair he had felt, the absolute separation from the source of all light and love. Then he searched for mercy. He found the Psalms, and the words of David felt like they were being torn from his own newly broken heart. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions." He read it over and over, the plea resonating with the raw, desperate cry of his own soul in those final moments before the light appeared. He read the story of the prodigal son, and for the first time he did not see a fable about forgiveness, but a precise blueprint of his own journey, the arrogant departure, the squandering of his inheritance in a distant country of disbelief, the desperate hunger in the pigsty of his own despair, and the shocking, undeserved welcome from a father who had been waiting all along. The words were no longer abstract theology. They were a map of his own damnation and redemption, and he was following its contours with the terrified focus of a man who had almost been lost forever. His search led him to a small, stone church a few blocks from his apartment, a building he had passed 1,000 times with barely a glance. He asked to speak with the priest. Father Mark was a man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a calm presence that filled the quiet of the book-lined study. Alex, his voice trembling, began to recount his experience, bracing for the kind of facile, pious reassurance he would have once mocked. But Father Mark simply listened, his hands steepled, his gaze unwavering. When Alex finished, the priest did not proclaim a miracle or try to convert him. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, intellectual depth that directly challenged the last remaining bastions of Alex's rationalism. He acknowledged the mystery, the parts of the divine that human reason could never fully contain. He spoke of hell not as a cartoonish pit of fire, but as a state of being, the ultimate, self-chosen separation from God, who is the source of all love, joy, and existence itself. The suffering, he suggested, was not an arbitrary punishment inflicted from without, but the natural, agonizing consequence of a soul finally understanding the full, beautiful weight of the love it had spent a lifetime rejecting. It was the eternal, conscious experience of having said no to the only thing that could ever truly satisfy it. This was not a contradiction to a loving God, Father Mark explained gently. It was the ultimate respect for human free will. God's love was an unceasing, unwavering offer, but he would never force himself upon a soul that had definitively and finally chosen to turn away. Then the priest spoke of the light Alex had seen. He called it a stunning and unmerited act of divine mercy, a prevenient grace that had reached into the consequences of Alex's own choices to offer a way back. It was proof that the door out of hell was not locked by God, but by the human heart, and that even the most ardent mocker could find the key of humility. The conversation was a profound dismantling of everything Alex had believed. His rational mind, which had demanded empirical evidence, had been given the most empirical evidence possible, a direct, personal, and visceral experience. His logical arguments about a universe without purpose were annihilated by the logical consistency of a universe built on love, free will, and consequence. Sitting in that quiet study, surrounded by the scent of old books and beeswax, Alex felt the final walls of his skepticism crumble into dust. He was not surrendering his intellect. He was finally allowing it to contemplate a reality infinitely grander and more terrifyingly beautiful than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The silence of his apartment was no longer an empty void, but a sacred space humming with a presence he had spent a lifetime denying. The sleek modern lines of his furniture, the cool glow of his dormant computer screens, all seemed to bow in reverence to a truth that now filled the room, a truth as solid and undeniable as the floor beneath his feet. Alex sat on the edge of his sofa, the events of the past weeks, the heart attack, the descent, the light, the confessions, the search, collapsing into a single focused point of understanding. The frantic thirst for answers had been quenched, not by a final, logical proof, but by a quiet, overwhelming inundation of peace. The war was over. The last prisoner of his own intellect had laid down its arms and surrendered. He did not know how to pray, not in the formal sense with recited words and folded hands. His prayers had always been arguments, monologues launched into a silent, indifferent universe. Now he simply sat in the stillness, his mind an open channel. He offered up the shattered pieces of his old self, the pride, the sarcasm, the condescending certainty. He did not ask for anything, he simply acknowledged. He acknowledged the crushing reality of the abyss from which he had been pulled. He acknowledged the terrifying, beautiful reality of the divine mercy that had reached for him there, a mercy that was not earned, not deserved, but lavishly, scandalously given. He acknowledged the existence of God, not as a philosophical concept or a primitive myth, but as the fundamental, loving consciousness at the heart of all things, the source of the light that had held him, the author of the grace that had rewritten his destiny. A warmth began to spread through his chest, a sensation entirely different from the searing heat of hell or the anxious dread of his hospital bed. It was a deep, resonant warmth that felt like coming home after an eternity of exile. It started in his core and radiated outward, loosening the last knots of tension in his shoulders, soothing the frantic rhythm of his heart, calming the tremors that had lived in his hands since his return. It was a peace that surpassed all his former understanding of the word, a peace that did not ignore the horrors he had witnessed but encompassed them, transforming his terror into a profound and humbling gratitude. He had been to the brink of eternal night and had been shown a dawn he could never have imagined. The conviction settled into his bones, as real and as physical as the scar on his chest. This was not a belief he had chosen. It was a reality that had chosen him, captured him, and set him free all at once. He thought of the souls he had seen in the darkness, their faces twisted in eternal regret. A fresh wave of sorrow washed over him, but it was clean, devoid of the selfish panic that had previously accompanied the memory. He understood now, with a clarity that felt like a divine download, that the mercy offered to him was not a unique exception. It was the default setting of the universe, a constant, pulsing invitation extended to every soul, a lifeline thrown into the stormy seas of every human life. The reality of hell was the reality of a choice finally and fully made, a door closed from the inside. But the reality of divine mercy was the reality that the door need never be closed at all. The love that had enveloped him in that moment of absolute hopelessness was available to the street preacher, to Sarah, to the faces from his online taunts, to every single person who had ever drawn breath. It was for all. And in the most humbling, soul-shattering revelation of all, it was for him. Alex the mocker. Alex the scoffer. Alex, the man who had built an identity on godlessness, was utterly, completely, and unconditionally loved. He bowed his head not in defeat but in acceptance, and for the first time in his life he felt truly, entirely whole. The scent of simmering broth and baking bread had become a new kind of incense, a holy offering in the humble space of the city's shelter. Alex stood behind the serving line, a simple apron tied over his clothes, a ladle in his hand that felt more purposeful than any keyboard ever had. He served stew to a shuffling line of men and women, their faces etched with the hard lines of life on the streets. He met each pair of eyes, offering a quiet nod, a simple, "Hope this helps," his voice stripped of its old condescension, filled now with a genuine humility. He was not here as a superior being performing charity. He was a fellow traveler, a man who had been spiritually bankrupt and now understood the value of even the smallest act of kindness. Washing dishes in the steamy, clattering kitchen afterwards was not a chore, but a meditation, the warm, soapy water a tangible grace, cleansing more than just plates. One evening, the shelter director, a weary but kind-eyed woman named Maria, asked if anyone had a story to share, something to offer a little hope. A few of the regulars spoke of small victories and setbacks. Then Alex felt a strange, quiet compulsion. He did not stand to preach or perform. He simply stepped slightly forward, his hands, still damp from the sink, clasped gently in front of him. He began to speak, his voice low but clear, carrying in the hushed room. He did not speak as a theologian or a mystic, but as a man who had been profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. He told them of his old life, of the arrogance that had been his armor, of the mocking memes and the intellectual pride that had built a fortress around a hollow soul. He saw his own former smugness reflected in the skeptical glances of a few listeners, and it only made his testimony more urgent. Then he told them of the fall. He described the crushing pain, not in clinical terms, but as the shattering of his entire world. He spoke of the descent into the oppressive heat and the echoing screams, the landscape of despair that was the ultimate destination of a life lived without love. He did not embellish or dramatize. The raw, horrific truth of the memory was powerful enough. He described the guilt, the recognition of his own cruelty. In the tormented faces around him, a profound silence had fallen over the room, the usual clatter and murmur stilled. They were listening, these men and women who knew the taste of despair, and they understood the language of consequence. And then he shared the miracle, the impossible light, the voice that was not a sound but a resonance of unconditional love and mercy. He described the offer of a second chance, a redemption that had nothing to do with his worthiness and everything to do with a grace that was boundless, shocking, and available to even the most ardent mocker. He finished by looking around the room, his gaze resting on each face. "I'm not special," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The mercy that found me in that place, it's for everyone. It's for you. No matter what you've done, no matter how far you've fallen, that door isn't locked from the outside. It's a choice." He wasn't trying to convert them. He was simply bearing witness to a truth that had saved him. Afterward, a man with tired eyes and gnarled hands approached him, not for more food, but to quietly ask, "You really believe that? That it's for guys like me?" And in that simple question, Alex found a joy deeper than any intellectual victory had ever provided, the joy of sharing the message of a mercy he had once mocked, and seeing a flicker of its impossible, healing light in the eyes of another lost soul.